Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of This Is Your Captain Speaking. Today, I'm really excited to have somebody on that's going to be bringing us through everything branding and brand implementation, rebranding, bringing your brand up to the next level based on all of the work that he's done across many Fortune 500 companies. I've got the founder of TenTen on, who's TenTen is a brand implementation firm that helps organizations plan, build, and manage brand change. Um, Over the past 8 years, they've helped over 100 companies rebrand across industries across the world. Some of the companies include companies such as GE Healthcare, Lincoln Financial, and J&J, just to name but a few. Also, the US Army is also in that list as well. So I'm really excited to have the founder of 1010 on today. It's Darren Horwitz. Nice to meet you,
Thanks, Andy.
Darren.
Thank you. Very excited to be here. Great to see you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Darren.
I do brand implementation, which is really what we specialize in, is in the logistics of helping organizations figure out how to connect a brand identity, whether it's the strategy or the logo or the colors or the voice, all the way through to everywhere that brand is experienced. And so our job is to really come in and understand all the different ways it comes to life, what the different rules are, things like that. And so if you think about, just as an analogy, if you think about an airport, you can think through traffic control and they land all the planes and there's a lot going on, but actually there's a lot more going on in an airport that people don't even think about. So our job in the example of an airport would be, yes, we understand traffic control, we understand how to fly planes, but we also understand security, we understand the food court, we understand what it's like at the front desk. So that's the specialty, figuring out how to get things done in change, brand change. But I've been doing this probably 15, 20 years now. And prior to that was in television production. So it's kind of a through line of understanding how to do things and speaking a little bit of different people's languages along the way.
Awesome. So I seen that prior you were also in, like as you mentioned, in TV production and so on. How did you manage to get into what you're doing now? Like, how did the concept of 1010 come about?
Wow. Yeah. So I was working for HBO at the time and went through some change. I wanted to do something different, and a recruiter, a friend of mine, had suggested the world of branding, which I didn't even know it existed. And back then, the role of what I do was really around production and building files and mechanicals, and it wasn't very glamorous. Over time, I realized that I wanted to get out from behind a computer and start talking to people. And then about the same time that people started to realize that we had something to say. And it came down to somebody asking me, I got a job in branding. I was working at a company called Interbrand, which is a global branding firm. And one of the strategists came down and said, we have a client, they're looking to rebrand and they want to know how much it costs. Do you know? And I said, no, but we can figure this out. And so for me, that was the first time that we really started to think about implementation planning and starting to understand everywhere the brand lives and working with the clients to figure out what are the right tools, templates, and guidelines. What's the right time frame of when you're looking to launch a brand versus when you start versus what's realistic, understanding how to prioritize things. And then lastly, this big question of, and what's all this going to cost? So we were doing this for a company called Humana, which was an insurance company, and it just clicked. And I saw this opportunity of, I wanted to go out there and help people figure this out. I wanted to get out from behind a computer. I wanted to travel a little bit and be working with clients. And this was a space that nobody was really working in, or at least not in the company at Interbrand. So I was very fortunate that they supported this. And then from there, I was hired by another company called Future Brand to lead the implementation for American Airlines when they did a rebrand some time ago. And again, loved going through figuring all this out. And it got to the point where I said, I love what I do. I think there's an opportunity here to really focus on this, and I was being pulled far away from the actual doing, and I was managing people and managing projects, and it just was not as much fun. And so I thought of this idea of 1010 where I could go out and help people through a rebrand. And I started shopping it around a little bit to friends and family and colleagues to see what they thought. And it was a colleague, an ex-Humana client, where I went to see him and I talked to him about this idea of going and helping people through rebrands and really specializing in that. And he said, well, that's great, but what happens if I'm not rebranding? And I said, that's a great question. And it took me about 6 months to really figure out that it wasn't just about rebranding. It was actually how do we protect the investment that one's making in a rebrand? And that's where I came up with the idea of plan, build, manage. You're either planning for a rebrand, in which case we know how to come in, uncover what's needed, start to put timelines together, put budgets together, really dig in deep with organizations around what they need to be rebranded, and therefore what's needed to support that. Build. Now you need to build the tools, whether it's you doing it, partners, or us. We just want to make sure that the right tools are being done at the right time in the right way, being efficient. Or manage. You've launched. Now what? Well, let's think about training. Let's think about governance. Let's think about making sure that your brand is being experienced the way you intended, because the further you get away from where you started, I think the more there's a chance from it to just be kind of not falling apart, but just being different than what your intention is. And so there's an opportunity to come in and really evaluate how the brand is being used and therefore experienced by the consumers and also your own people to say, maybe we need to tweak this a little bit. So that's kind of where it came from and how I got to where I am today. And I feel very fortunate to now we're about 9 years in and just, I love what I do. And it's just a lot of fun. It's great.
Nice. It's a really great story, by the way, Darren. How you started
Thank you.
from being behind the desk to getting to in front of more clients, being able to go out and work with people, get out on the road, get out and travel. We were just speaking before we started this about your passion for travel and some of the travel that you got planned in the future and so on. It's really cool, man. I've got
Thank you.
what type of companies do you guys focus on? So what's your sweet spot?
I would say I enjoy B2B businesses. I enjoy B2B within their manufacturing. We've done a lot of healthcare, though. There's been a lot of transition in healthcare organizations going through acquisitions. And we've done quite a bit of those. But I think B2B is great because what I have found is it's oftentimes we're working with people who haven't gone through a launch of any kind or a rebrand. And they're excited, but they're also anxious. And we can come in and really help them figure out how to do this in a way that works for them and figure out the right budget, the right timing, the right needs. And it's not about doing everything at once. It's about let's right size this for you. I think in the world of consumer, it's great as well, but I think they have more experience in product launches. So they know what they're doing, and it's less of an exercise of helping somebody understand it. It's a lot more tactical oftentimes. So I enjoy working with people who are learning something fresh for the first time and then hopefully walking away with a great experience, or they've gone through it once before, not a great experience, and we're going to kind of build off that and say, let's do it a little bit better this time.
Yeah, it's interesting. B2B is like a bit like the forgotten younger brother of B2C in a way, or a younger sibling, let's say, of B2C, and that they try to follow the footsteps as best they can, but they need to learn from their mistakes along the way as well. So it's in B2B it's definitely interesting, and also that anxiety that you mentioned, I fully understand that and appreciate that. I think as well, there's so much alignment that needs to happen across many different pieces of an organization. From like, I would guess that you're mostly dealing with marketers, and then that will then go into probably C-suite as well. To have it might start with the marketing team, but then you need to get buy-in from senior leadership as well, right? And there might be one person from the marketing team, the senior leadership, CMO, for example, but then CEO needs to be involved. Other C levels need to be involved. And that's also like a anxiety riddled process if you don't fully know what you're doing there, right?
Yeah, it can be. And here's the trick. It's not going in with a marketing centric point of view. The trick is to work with people who do other things within the organization to understand their needs. And to us, marketing may own it. Marketing will decide if you're going through a rebrand. Certainly marketing and C-suite will decide what a new logo looks like, what the color palette looks like, what the voice sounds like, and certainly the strategy. But everybody else has to use this. And I think the trick is to go in and bring people to the table to say, what do you do? How do we ensure that you have the right tools at the right time? So going back to the airport example, maybe the control tower is the one who's defining the logo and the marketers are the ones flying the planes. But beyond that, you have a whole other set of people doing different jobs with different needs. And so I think branding works in the same way. PowerPoint's an easy one. Yeah, we all use a PowerPoint maybe, or Google Slides or whatever it is. And that's an easy thing to think about. But what about signs on walls? They have very different needs than a PowerPoint deck. And so there's somebody who specializes in this. And for marketing to just say, here's a logo, here's a color palette, yeah, go put signs up on walls, that's not very realistic. And more important is not only what needs to happen, but when you expect it to happen. And I think the watch out there is oftentimes what we find are senior level people putting deadlines in the ground without being well informed of what it's going to take to achieve those goals from a rebrand perspective. And so the sooner you can start talking to others about what you're trying to achieve, the more realistic you can be with managing expectations of not only C-suite, but also those that actually need to do something. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, B2B also, I think, has the added challenge of, with a consumer brand, you see the products out there. It's very tangible. You know, they understand what the needs are. In a B2B brand, I think branding's just a little bit squishier. And so they really have to understand the value and the purpose and what it can do for you and how it can help grow a business, whether it's consumer facing or out there like a product or more behind the scenes working B2B.
Yeah, fully agree with that. And so some of the things that you just said there about managing expectations, there's a timing thing there as well. I think at least in the space that I operate in, the deadline when it comes from senior leadership is always yesterday. You know, that's very typical, right? And I'm sure it's not too different in the clients that you're working with. But also cost, right? I think if people are just not informed generally, if they don't have the experience. So let's take, for example, CEOs that may not have been involved in a rebrand or a brand exercise before, or at least from an operational perspective. So don't understand all of the different bits and pieces in terms of what's it involved, right? That's a timing thing, but also like in terms of the cost to the business of doing this, not just in assets that are being produced. So let's say, as you said, like if a new logo is produced, that means new logos then need to appear across every single asset that you have. Now that's something that may not be in the mind of the CEO. For example, it might be like, oh shoot, actually, if we go and recreate this logo, that means I need to not just do it on the website, but every printed document that we have out in the market at the moment then needs to be reflecting our new VI, right? But also the cost like around that, like how are you managing those expectations from a cost perspective? Do you have like a guidelines, checklist type of scope that you're able to like hand over to people so that they understand exactly what they should be expecting?
In short answer, yes. But it's a little bit more of an exercise. So I think there's a few things in there that I want to touch upon. One is just to remind ourselves that it's not just about putting a logo on something else, right? There's also, there's an education that goes with this. There's a voice that needs to change usually. There's an understanding of how to reach people internally to make sure that they can really understand, adopt, and carry forward our brand through every experience. So it's the simple thing is, yes, where does my logo live? The harder thing is, oh, but wait, we have fonts, we have colors, we have phone scripts, help centers, things like that. So it's a bigger conversation.
That's the issue with the CEO again. Sorry to interrupt you. That's the issue because they see it as we're doing a rebrand, we're doing a new logo, where it's actually every single interaction that somebody internally and externally has with your brand.
That's correct.
Your organization is the brand. That's a living, breathing thing, right?
That's correct. And I've heard specifically one of your other guests talk about this as well, where it's every experience, and it is. So the first thing we do is when we do workshops to uncover what needs to change, the first thing we say is, okay, in your organization, is brand synonymous with logo? And that's very telling when they come back with an answer, because it tells us how much effort they need to put into educating people internally about what their brand means versus, no, actually we understand culture, hiring, the walls and what we put on the walls inside the office spaces, all of this is related. And if they understand that, it's an easier conversation. If they don't, then we focus a little bit more about, okay, how do we educate senior leaders on the idea that your brand is more than your logo? But going back to your point, what we do is we start by cataloging everywhere the brand is experienced. And different businesses have different needs, but for the most part, we can come in with different topics and say, okay, marketing materials, environments, sales enablement, paid media, owned media, livery, whatever it is, we'll dig down and understand where and how the brand is being used. From there, we say, okay, if this is everywhere your brand is experienced, here are the recommended tools, templates, and guidelines that we think are necessary. We're not trying to do this for every single item. We're trying to find the least amount of tools with the most amount of value. And that's how we start to think about savings. We'll then start to think about prioritization of conversion. So in a post-pandemic world, does everyone need an ID badge to go into an office? Probably not. So maybe we're not spending the money on ID badges the way we used to. Business cards. What's a business card? Maybe we don't need to spend money on printed costs because everything's all digital. So there are ways to keep our costs down, but we're evaluating what's a priority and what needs to happen. Salespeople will probably say, yes, I need a business card. C-suite probably wants a business card. Okay, so there's an investment we would want to make there, and we'll identify those costs. But the strategy is to figure out what's the most important, what's the most client-facing, what's the most high-profile piece that you need to think through. How do you prioritize that in a way that's smart? And then ultimately, when we come up with this overall budget, it's to say, okay, this is your wish list. Nobody gets their wish list. So let's be prepared to follow up with, if we're saying it's $1 million, and I'm making that up, you're not going to get $1 million. Your C-suite is going to come in and say, do it for $500,000. That's fine. We're prepared. Let's then go back in with all the data that we have to figure out what's the best way to invest that $500,000 in what period of time that allows you to then get the most out of your new brand or go through this in a very optimized, efficient, impactful way. So does that address your question?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm actually super happy to hear that, because it's taking it realistic. Like I've worked with some branding firms in the past that have just really been highball, like it's like, okay, this entire project's going to cost $1 million, that's it. It's like, well, we don't have that type of money, right? Yeah. I mean, clearly it wasn't properly mapped out, right? And for very little we were being charged quite a lot. That's the
there's another challenge in there along those lines, and going back to managing expectations is you raise an interesting point, which is about, we didn't expect it to cost this much. We get often, we're asked this, why didn't our brand agency tell us this? And why didn't they tell us we needed more? And my response is, having come from the brand agencies, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. Oftentimes, the people we work with were not part of the initial scope of work or deal. I think it's a few things. Nobody's going to walk in the door and say, you need to spend $10 million. We're in an RFP competitive process. You should hire us. The next agency is saying it's $1 million. We're telling you it's 10 because it's realistic. And you're saying you're smoking crack, right? It's not happening. And they go with somebody else. So in a competitive market, you can't walk in the door telling somebody that, because nobody believes you. They say we're special, which is why we exist, to help them really understand how special they are and what their needs are very specifically. But back to the original scope of work, you start with some very straightforward needs. You need brand strategy, you need brand voice, you need visual identity, and you need some guidelines. That is the tip of the iceberg. That said, even if they have gone in and said there's going to be more to do, things like marketing collateral, things like your website, again, nobody's thinking about that to begin with. And the C-suite person who decides to sign off on a brand agency's work may say, I don't want to see that in this proposal. We'll deal with that in phase 2. Well, now your marketing director gets the project and says, wait a second, why aren't you doing a PowerPoint deck for me? Well, that was taken out of the original scope of work to keep costs down. So it's a very unfair thing for people to come in and say, we should have known about this and it's the agency's fault. I think the way to look at a rebrand project is to say there are phases. There's the initial work. and then there's more to come. Yes, but let's then talk about what that looks like for you to make it right for you. And again, going back to right sizing this, but there is a little bit of balance in there of, hey, this will set you up. We're going to get a lot done, but there's still more to come. But yeah, that's often the conversation. People complain. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to setting those expectations again and keeping alignment across the different teams, and then also being a service level agreement there. And it sounds as though the way that you work, I'm reading between the lines here, and also based on the profile, is very structured and very, not, I don't want to say template driven, but you've got it, you've got your playbook, and you've got a specific way of rolling out a rebrand or a brand refresh or whatever it might be, that you've got different elements included in how you guys approach it, right?
There's definitely a process that we go through. What I tell people is this: the process that we have is set. I've worked for decades to try and figure out the most efficient process to get people through the question to the answer in a very short period of time with having confidence behind the answer. Recognizing that everyone is different. What I say is your inputs are what drive the outputs. I'm going to take you through the journey. You're going to tell me what you do and how you do it. And based on that, I'm going to then demonstrate how I would solve the problem. And we can talk about whether you agree with my solutions or my recommendations or not. And then we can right size from there. However, oftentimes, going back to your point of I need it yesterday, how quickly can you tell me how much this is going to cost?
Yeah. I've been
typically
that person asking that question as well.
Yeah, well, it's oftentimes we can listen. We say, depending on availability, it's usually about 4 weeks to get through the process. We've done it quicker. We were even flown up to Alaska and spent a week on the ground doing the whole thing out of a hotel. We can do it. However, I think, going back to the B2B example, and I'll give you in the example of GE Healthcare. So we were brought in to help GE go through their spinoffs. We helped two of the organizations, two of the businesses. In this case, specifically with GE Healthcare, they were launching their brand in probably 2 months from the time we got involved, maybe 3 months. And they said, we need a plan now. How long is all this going to take? Well, company your size, maybe it'll take 4, 6 weeks. Oh, we don't have that. What can we do? And we said, all right, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we start with a hypothesis? We have enough experience to feel confident in what you're going to need. It's not going to be perfect, but it's a great starting place. And what we can do is we can start with our hypothesis that we can get done. Give us a week or so. We'll share it with you, gut check it with you. But then what we want to do is start to validate it with the different business units or the different stakeholders to make sure that we're considering their needs and thinking about it. So we reversed the process. We still got to the same end result, which is, yes, we have it right. But the storyline was, this is where we're starting from. This is what we think to be right based on experience. However, we're going to validate this across 200 different people to make sure that we're accounting for all their needs. And that was the way they were very happy with that. The word they used was, they saw us as very flexible. So yes, a very a standard process, but we were able to swap it around because that's what the need was. And that's how it goes. But we still validated it in the long run and got them what they needed.
That's nice. I like the word flexibility there, right? I think that's something that stands to you as a business as well, and also to your client base, and enabling you to fit what you guys do within a certain template or within a certain boundary, right? That you're able to then go in and make that a bit more flexible for those businesses. Good.
But I think nobody wants to be told this is the way to do it. Either do it this way or don't do it. You can go find somebody else. I mean, what kind of business is that? That doesn't make any sense to me.
There's plenty of them.
Well, that's not my business. My business is I start from a place of, first of all, I start from a place of brand empathy, which is there's somebody on the other end of this phone that has to do a job and they have to use the brand. No matter what I think it is, doesn't really matter. It's what they need it for. So when we work with organizations, it's the same storyline. Again, don't think about this just from marketing. Have empathy from the person down the road who needs to do something with this. Understand their needs. And I think it's the same thing with, you're going through a brand change. I know you're stressed. I get it. People are very stressed. So let's try and find a way to give you some comfort in what you need in a way that works for you. Because otherwise, there's no business there. That's
100%.
me personally, though.
No, I fully. So you're singing from the hymn sheet that I like listening to. So I fully agree with that approach. It's interesting while you were mentioning like your approach to things at 1010 and how you see the world and also the size of the business that you work with and also the template or the playbook that you're using. Have you ever considered writing a book about it?
First of all, my team will tell you how much they hate listening to my voice go on and on. So let's start there. Now you want me to put it in writing? I think they'd give me a very hard time about that.
Don't listen to them, Darren. Don't listen to them.
You know, I love it, and I thank you. I think I have to figure out what the most valuable information would be, and the challenge is that rebranding is not something you do every day, right? So if I do something and I put it in a book, what good is it? That book is maybe short-lived. I don't know. I think people would want to hear more war stories of like what went wrong and you know, but it's interesting. I'd like to think there's something there, but that's because I geek out on this stuff and I live in this world. But I appreciate you asking that.
The reason why, let me tell you the reason why. Let me tell you the reason. So I spoke yesterday on the same podcast to April Dunford. I don't know if you've ever heard of April. April is a messaging and positioning expert in the mostly in the B2B tech SaaS space, right? And like has written a book around which is called Obviously Awesome, right? This is the book here. I'll send you a link afterwards. So this one here, and I'm not
Great.
No plug for April. You're welcome though, April. But her book was based around like a process that she had put in place at large scale organizations in B2B, right, in tech. And she just assumed that everybody knew what they were doing when it came to like a messaging and positioning exercise. And it's very similar to what you're doing is that both brand and messaging and positioning, they're shake each other's hands basically, right? One is balancing the other, right? And one influences heavily the other and vice versa, right? And one of the things that kept on coming up when we were speaking about it yesterday was that she just assumed that everybody knew what they were doing. And so many parallels in terms of what you've just said there as well around like people have tried to implement it before and just failed and they didn't really get it right because there was no real like experience there or like a playbook or a set of like a template to go off of, like, or step 1 to 10 in terms of how I can bring my brand through this and et cetera, right? So the reason why I mention is because there's so many parallels to everything that you've just said on the brand side in comparison to what we spoke about yesterday with April on the messaging and positioning side. So the reason why I say I think there's a niche there for you.
I appreciate that. I'm going to start by reading April's book. And no, I appreciate that. I listen, I'd love, my mission right now is to be out there introducing people to the concept of brand implementation. And we just went through an exercise internally where we were doing some work and, you know, just kind of evaluating our own stuff. We were looking at customer journey maps of our customers and our clients. And what we realized was that there was something, we talk about what we do as a business, but we never once stopped to say, by the way, this is what implementation means to us. This is what brand it. We haven't done a good job at ensuring that there's a common definition. And I think right now, my mission, whether it's through a book like April's or having conversations with people like you or whatever it is, it's to really ensure that people understand what brand implementation is as a concept, why it's important, what can go wrong if they don't do it properly, and we've seen things go wrong, how you can scale this. It doesn't, so yes, I'm very fortunate I get to work with very large brands, but I also work with very small brands, and I enjoy it just as much because, again, I'm going through the same concept of trying to help people close a gap between I'm launching a brand and I'm putting it out there consistently everywhere it lives, whether it's a small organization, whether it's a startup or a big healthcare system, doesn't matter. It's the same concept. But again, I appreciate the idea of putting a book out there. I'll definitely give that some thought to really think through how to continue the conversation around brand implementation. I guess thinking back as I'm thinking out loud now, even in my own concept, there's still the whole side of manage, right? It's not just about a rebrand. It's once you're out there, how do how do you protect that investment? So thank you. That's a great idea. I'm definitely
How
going
do
to
you
start.
keep it going? It's the I think like the planning is one thing, but the execution on it and the execution over time is where that's where the implementation comes in, right?
Yeah.
That's where you guys are specializing. Well, in all areas, but the continuing execution of making sure that, as you said, your investment is making sense, right?
Yeah, and as companies grow and evolve, they change their strategy, they change their positioning a little bit, they evolve what they're saying. I think so too has to go every other thing that goes with it to ensure that it's being carried out across the organization and then externally as well consistently. I think that's right.
Absolutely. Okay, Darren, look, we're just on time now. We've actually gone over a little bit. It's been super interesting chatting. So, tell me a little bit about where people can find you. Where's the best place for people to reach out, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Super simple. TenTenGroup.com, all spelled out TenTenGroup.com. The website, they can get a hold of us there. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, Darren Horwitz, Horwitz. Happy to talk brand implementation with anybody. As I said, I love this. Hopefully they can tell I'm very passionate about this.
Absolutely. Well, I've been able to tell. I'm sure the audience will as well, Darren. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. It's been great speaking.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate your time.
Sure. Guys, this has been another episode of This Is Your Captain Speaking. Tune in again next week for more great content. And Darren, it's been really great speaking. Thanks again.
Thank you.